This is lecture 118 in the ABCs of Communism series that this particular set of lectures accompanies or is meant to support volume 7 on communism in Europe when it appears by next year. At any rate, our lecture topic today is from feudalism to capitalism in Russia. And we'll begin with a 1797 order by Paul I of Russia that described a serf's obligatory service to be 3 days a week as normal and sufficient for the landowner's needs. In the Black Earth region, 77% of the serfs performed that service, and the rest paid levies. In Russia, serfs were obliged to perform corvée labor for the landowner on his portion of the land that was of the highest quality. For them were allotted the poorer quality land. Serfs were not free to marry whomever they desired, and mobility was heavily restricted, which did not leave many options in choosing a spouse. To make things harder, there were constraints on the marriage of serfs. Landowners imposed restrictions for their estates, and families and communities established guidelines. The Russian Orthodox Church had many rules regarding marriage to be strictly observed by the population, and marriage was not allowed to take place during times of fasting, the eve or day of a holiday, during the entire week of Easter, or for 2 weeks after Christmas. The entire empire had to follow these rules put into place by the Tsar and his church. In the AD 1100s, day after day, serfs worked the land of their lords. They barely had time to cultivate the land allotted to them to take care of their family. The landlords had divided the farmers' common lands into large fields worked on by rotation. The lords divided the fields into strips. Each farmer's family was forced to work many strips in each field, and a princely unit had defined property and personal rights. In the 1200s and 1400s, a feudal unit included a definite number of previously free but now enserfed farmers. By 1450, Russia's Ivan III ruled that the right of enserfed farmers to leave their master's land was limited to 1 week before and after Yuri's Day, which was November 26th. In 1497, this time limit was made universal for everybody. The enserfed farmers and petty bourgeoisie of the villages were now officially tied to the land. Naturally, Russians ever after battled against their masters, whether they were Russians or Mongols. Now, the Russian population of the borderland suffered invasion from Turkic language-speaking Tatars. Eventually, the Tatars became allies of the Mongol Empire. At any rate, tens of thousands of Russian noblemen were required to protect Russia's southern border. This expense was heavy for the Tsar's government, which of course shifted the cost onto the enserfed farmers. In 1550, the Tsar increased taxes so that enserfed farmers refusing to bring the harvest from the fields to his master was fined or killed. In 1597, the Tsar's regent, Boris Fyodorich Godunov, took away the enserfed farmers' Yuri's Day right to movement, although altogether permanently placing them under feudal full serfdom. In 1607, a new defined punishment for hiding and keeping runaways, including fines paid to the regime and to the owner of the farmer, was enacted. The Code of 1649 gave serfs to the estates. In 1658, Russian landowners won unlimited ownership over serfs, and their flight was a criminal offense. The landowner could transfer the serf without land to another landowner while keeping the serf's personal property and family. In 1678, 80% of Russian farmers were serfs. Free farmers could only be found in the north and northeast. These nobles were finally satisfied. The latifundistas and the nobles of the south wanted more severe measures against the runaways who fled south of Russia and petitioned the Tsar accordingly. He concurred and established a longer limit for finding of runaways. The nobility continued to demand that the Tsar's government sponsor the search for the runaways. The legislation after 1650 focused on the punishment of runaways. Meanwhile, the nobles had little incentive to improve the land and lived in fear of serf uprisings. Serfs suffered such complete oppression that they rose less often. The Cossacks and the nomads were the first to rebel. Then there were many rebellions against their bondage in conjunction with the Cossack uprising. These uprisings included those of Ivan Bolatinnikov and Stenka Razin. Then in 1679, agricultural slaves were converted into serfs. However, for the downtrodden that was not enough, and afterwards more Cossack rebellions followed under Kondraty Bulavin and then Yemelyan Pugachev. The Cossack uprisings had benefited from disgruntled serfs, who in turn received encouragement from these Cossack rebellions. However, none of these Cossack revolts were directed against the institution of serfdom. Peasants in Cossack-dominated areas became Cossacks, thus escaping from serfdom. Serfdom remained in Russia much later than in other emerging capitalist European countries. In fact, slavery remained a legally recognized institution in Russia until 1723, when Peter the Great converted the household slaves into house serfs. Conversions of slaves to serf status and the later ban on the sale of serfs without land did not stop the trade in household slaves, but merely changed its name. The private owners of the serfs regarded the law as a formality. Instead of sale of a peasant, newspapers would advertise a servant for hire. After the end of the Pugachev rebellions in 1799, there were many outbreaks across Russia. Thereafter, serf farmers were never quiet for long. So in the 1700s, along the way, Russian farmers had been escaping to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and becoming a major concern for the Tsarist regime. Russian armies raided territories of the Commonwealth, kidnapping many locals, forcing them into submission. In 1762, Peter III announced two measures presaging the abolition of serfdom. He ended mandatory military service for nobles with the abolition of compulsory noble state service. This provided a rationale to end serfdom. Second was the secularization of the Church of States, which transferred its serf farmers and its land to regime jurisdiction. In 1775, Catherine II began to prosecute landowners for the cruel treatment of serfs. Her measures were strengthened in 1817 and 10 years later again in 1827. She ordered landowners to help serfs in times of famine and to keep grain for them in reserve. All these attempts at reform within the feudal stage failed. In fact, the trade in landless serfs, regarded as mere chattel, flourished. In fact, the slave trade in the eastern Russian provinces survived until the 20th century. The Colloquy, published in London, England in 1857 to 65 and in Geneva from 1865 to 67, proved many cases of horrendous physical, emotional, and sexual abuse of serfs by landowners. Nevertheless, when abolition of feudalism did come, it was too late to assist the growth of capitalism in Russia as compared to Western Europe. Russia was far behind Western Europe. That was not undergoing agricultural and industrial revolution. The Russian aristocrats and nobles were not interested in adopting progressive labor practices. They had preferred to mortgage serfs to capitalists for profit. In 1798, Ukrainian landlords were banned from selling serfs apart from the land. In 1804, 48% of Russian factory workers were serfs, 52% in 1825. Landless serfs rose from 4.14% in 1835 to 6.79% in 1858. They received no land in the emancipation. Landlords deliberately increased the number of domestic serfs when they anticipated serfdom's demise. In 1816, 17, and 19, serfdom had been abolished in Estland, Courland, and Livonia, respectively, as capitalists built factories. However, all agricultural land stayed in noble hands, and labor rent lasted until 1868. It was replaced with the landless laborers and sharecropping. Landless workers had to ask permission to leave an estate. In 1820, their owners mortgaged 20% of all serfs to capitalist credit institutions. In fact, a fifth of the serfs were mortgaged, half by 1842. After 1830, the female and male ages for marriage were 16 and 18 respectively. To marry over the age of 60 the serf had to receive permission. Marriage over the age of 80 was forbidden, and the church also did not approve marriages with large age differences. In 1841, landless nobles were banned from selling serfs, although too weak to oppose the emancipation of the serfs. In 1850, serf farmers composed a majority of the population. The 1857 census recorded the number of private serfs was 23.1 million. In a Russian population of 62.5 million, that was 38% of the population. 7% of serfs were domestic, landless servants. In 1859, 66% of all serfs were mortgaged to capitalists. Any way you looked at it, the bourgeoisie had been allowed to own serfs from 1721 to 1762, and from 1798 to 1860. A third of the nobles' estates and two-thirds of their serfs were mortgaged to noble banks, or the Tsarist regime itself. The nobility had been weakened by the scattering of their estates, lack of primogeniture, and a high turnover of serfs. In 1860, 10.5 million Russians were privately owned, 9.5 million were in regime ownership, and nearly 1 million were under the Tsar's personal jackboot. Russia was at a crossroads because the burgeoning capitalist class needed a free-to-move workforce. Tsar Alexander I and his advisors considered their options. They had begun by extending the right to own land to most classes, including rich and serf farmers, in 1801. In 1803, they created the category of free agriculturalist for serf farmers that had been voluntarily emancipated by their masters. However, the great majority of serfs were not relieved, and an underground massive revolt was organizing. Capitalists and their intellectual agents in the universities and the press were amalgamating with the underground. The Tsarist regime was doomed unless it got out in front of the tidal wave poised to engulf the empire. And it did. In 1861, the central government of the Tsar Alexander II issued the Order of Great Emancipation. It freed most serfs in a major agrarian reform intended to liberate the farmers from above rather than wait until they won their freedom by rising from below. The terms of abolition were not universal to the empire, and in any event they were harsh, and simply increased revolutionary pressure. Arising in the ashes was the anarchist movement People's Will. The serfs still had to work for the landlord for 2 years. The nobles kept nearly all the meadows and forests, had their debts paid by the government, while the former serfs paid 34% over the market price for the shrunken plots they kept. This figure was 90% in the northern regions, 20% in the Black Earth region, and 0 in the Polish provinces. Landowners were interested in keeping all of their serfs and not losing workers to marriages on other estates. If a serf wanted to marry a widow, then emancipation and death certificates were to be handed over and investigated for authenticity by their owner before marriage could take place. Before and after the abolition of serfdom, Russian peasant families were patriarchal. Marriage was important for families economically and socially. Parents were in charge of finding suitable spouses for their children in order to help the family, and were not interested in true love when there were mouths to feed and fields to tend. The bride's parents were concerned with the social and material benefits they would gain in the alliance between the two families. Some also took into consideration their daughter's future quality of life and how much work would be required of her. The groom's parents would be concerned about economical factors such as the size of the dowry, as well as the bride's decency, modesty, obedience, ability to work, and family background. Upon marriage, the bride came to live with her new husband and his family, so she needed to be ready to assimilate and work hard. Serfs looked highly upon early marriage because of increased parental control, as at a younger age there was less chance of an individual falling in love with someone other than whom his or her parents chose. The average age of marriage for women was around 19 years old. During serfdom, when their children were disobeying the head of the house, he could have the master or landowner step in. after the emancipation of serfs in 1861, the household patriarch lost some of that power and could no longer receive the landowner's help. The younger generations now had the freedom to work off their estates and to work in factories, which was, of course, the point to the whole thing. These younger farmers had access to newspapers and books, which introduced them to radical thought. The ability to work outside of the household gave the younger farmers independence as well as a wage to do with as they wished, whereas agricultural and domestic jobs, being a group effort, gave income to the family. Children who worked industrial jobs gave their earnings to their family as well, but some used it as a way to gain a say in their own marriages. In this case, some families allowed their sons to marry whom they chose, as long as the family was in similar economic standing as their own. No matter what, parental approval was required in order to make a marriage legal. In the late 1890s, the ethnographer Semyonova noted that husband and wife were assigned different household duties. In ownership, the husband assumed the property plus any funds required to make additions to the property. Additions included fence, barns, and wagons. While primary purchasing power belonged to the husband, the wife was expected to buy certain items. She was also expected to buy household items such as bowls, plates, pots, barrels, and a variety of utensils. Wives were required to purchase cloth and make clothes for the family by spinning. Footwear was the husband's responsibility, and he created tree bark shoes and felt boots for the family. As for crops, men sowed and women harvested. A common crop harvested by serfs in the Black Earth region was flax. The husband owned most of the livestock, such as pigs and horses. Cows were the property of the husband, but kept by the wife. Chickens were considered the wife's property, and sheep were the common property of the family. In the meantime, the Russian state apparatus, that is, the police, army, and navy, had supported serfdom with its conscription of serfs. This had placed the youngest and strongest men under slave discipline, while simultaneously increasing the size of the Russian army. With its bigger military, Russia achieved victory in the Napoleonic and Russo-Persian Wars. Our founder, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, Lenin, established his credentials as a Marxist theoretician while suffering exile in Siberia at the hands of the Tsarist regime by finishing his book, The Development of Capitalism in Russia. In 1899, he was published in St. Petersburg under the pseudonym Vladimir Ilyin, so the publisher would not be shut down for publishing the writings of a known criminal subversive. Lenin proved that the anarchist people's will idea that Russia could avoid the stage of capitalism because rural communes could be the basis for communism was incorrect. He did this by showing that the rural communes had already been wiped out by capitalism. Statistics showed the degree to which feudalism was dying in Russia while capitalism was growing. The growth of a national market for goods in Russia had replaced local markets. Landowners now grew cash crops rather than the crops of subsistence agriculture. Along the way had come the growth of private property as juxtaposed against communal property. Lenin demonstrated that the farmers had divided between kulaks, serving as the bosses in the Tsar's agricultural economy, and the middle-income farmers. At the bottom was the growing landless rural proletariat, arising as some middle farmers collapsed. Lenin said Marxists could forge an alliance between the rural and urban proletariat. Such an alliance could force the middle strata of farmers to make a choice. The following is excerpted from the Marxist Internet Archive, Introduction to Lenin's great book, The Development of Capitalism in Russia, which was marked up and translated by my old friend. At any rate, Lenin's book, The Development of Capitalism in Russia, was the result of tremendous research lasting more than 3 years. Lenin began intensive work on his book when in prison, soon after his arrest, in connection with the case of the St. Petersburg League of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class, and finished it in the village of Shushkagoya, where he lived in exile. He had, however, been gathering material for his book long before he began writing it. In his first letter from prison, dated the 2nd of January 1896, Lenin wrote, quote, "I have a plan that has occupied my mind considerably ever since I was arrested, increasingly so as time passes. I have long been engaged on an economic problem, that of marketing of the products of manufacturing industry within the country, and have selected some literature, drawn up a plan for its analysis, and even done some writing with a view to having my work published in a book form, should its dimensions exceed those of a magazine article. I should be very unwilling to give up on the job, and am now apparently faced with the alternative of either writing it here or of abandoning it altogether." Now, he went on to say, in the same letter, in addition to giving instructions about books to be obtained according to a list he had drawn up, Lenin unfolded his plan of work. "The list of books," he wrote, "is divided into the two parts into which my book is divided. A, the general theoretical part. This requires fewer books, so that in any case I hope to write it, although it needs more preparatory work. And B, the application of the theoretical principles to Russian facts. This part requires very many books. The chief difficulty will be 1. Zemstvo publications, part of them, by the way, I already have, but another part, small monographs, may be ordered, and a part may be obtained through statisticians I know. And secondly, government publications, the papers of commissions, reports, and minutes of congresses. These are important, but they are more difficult to obtain. Some of them, even the majority, I think, are in the library of the Free Economic Society." Lenin's sister, A.I. Ulyanova Elizarova, relates in her reminiscences that while Vladimir Ilyich was working on his book in prison, quote, "he decided to use the St. Petersburg libraries in order to obtain material needed for the work he had planned and that he knew he would not be able to get in exile. And so in prison he made an intense study of a mass of source material and copied out numerous extracts. I dragged heaps of books to him from the Free Economic Society Library, from the Academy of Sciences, and from other scientific book repositories," unquote. Lenin also worked on the book while on his way to exile. In a letter dated March 15, 1897, he wrote that while on the way he had looked over some books, borrowed for a short while, and that he intended to send them back from Krasnoyarsk. During a halt at Krasnoyarsk en route to Shushkinskoye village, Lenin made a study of books and magazines that he found in the rich private library of G.V. Yudin, a merchant, and also in the local city library. While in exile, Lenin continued to work hard on the development of capitalism in Russia. Since he did not possess the means to buy large numbers of books, he wrote to his relatives asking them to make arrangements to supply him from libraries in the capital. Quote, "It would be very likely be more profitable for me to spend money on postage and have many books to spend than spend more money on buying a few books," unquote. On Lenin's instructions, his sister M.I. Ulyanova copied out numerous extracts from various books in the Rumyantsev Library in Moscow. Lenin received these extracts at the end of May 1897. From the autumn of the same year, he received the material he needed regularly and set to work on the new sources, particularly on the numerous statistical abstracts. In the spring of 1898, N.K. Krupskaya, who had secured a transfer from her place of exile in Ufa to Shushenskoye, brought Lenin many books. During his 3 years' work on the development of capitalism in Russia, Lenin studied and made a critical analysis of everything that had been written on Russian economics. In this monograph, mention is made of and passages are quoted from over 500 different books, abstracts, research papers, reviews, and articles. The literature, however, actually studied and used by Lenin, but not included among the sources mentioned, was much more extensive. But even this list gives an idea of the colossal amount of work involved in his study of the development of Russian capitalism. The draft of the development of capitalism in Russia was completed in August 1898 in a letter dated October 11, 1898, Lenin wrote, "I have finished drafting my markets, and I have begun to give them the finishing touches. The making of a fair copy will go on simultaneously, so that I have thought of sending it off in parts and of having it printed as it gets there in order to avoid delay. I expect to send off the first lot in a month's time at the very latest. If they begin printing it in December, it might just be in time for this season." Much time was needed to give the manuscript the finishing touches, and the job was completed at the end of January 1899. Lenin paid careful attention to the remarks of comrades and relatives who read The Development of Capitalism in Russia while it was still in manuscript. Each chapter was copied into a separate little notebook, and apart from Krupskaya, was read and discussed by other Social Democrats who were in exile at that time in the Minusинsk area. "We were the first readers, so to speak, of The Development of Capitalism in Russia," wrote G.M. Krasnansky in his reminiscences. He lived in exile, not far from Shuskoye village. "Whatever was sent to us, we read carefully and returned it to Lenin with our comments. He took our comments very much into consideration." The Development of Capitalism in Russia came off the press at the end of March in 1899 under the pseudonym of Vladimir Ilyin. The issue of 22,400 copies was sold out very quickly and circulated mainly among the social democratic intelligentsia, the student youth, and through the medium of propagandists in worker study circles. The bourgeois press tried to pass over Lenin's monograph in silence, and the first reviews did not appear until the autumn of 1899. One of them received a crushing retort from Lenin in his article, quote, "Uncritical Criticism," unquote, which was printed in the magazine Nausnoye Oboros Scientific Review in English for May-June 1900. At any rate, a second division of The Development of Capitalism in Russia appeared in 1908. Since the establishment of Soviet power, The Development of Capitalism in Russia has, according to date of October 1st, 1957, been published 75 times in a total of 3.5 million copies, and in 20 of the languages of the Soviet people, and in addition it has appeared in English, French, German, Spanish, Chinese, Czech, Hungarian, Japanese, Turkish, and other foreign languages. Part of the preparatory work for The Development of Capitalism in Russia, which shows the volume of the research done by Lenin and the methods he employed, has been published in the Lenin Miscellany, Volume 33. The present volume follows the second 1908 edition, which was published after the text had been corrected and supplemented by Lenin, and in addition, account has been taken of all the author's remarks concerning the first 1899 edition. So that brings us to a conclusion of our lecture on the development of capitalism in Russia. And next we're going to go to lecture 119 on Britain entering the imperialist phase.